Hey guys, this is Tommy from the Ravens Creek Study, and we've been trucking through kind of a Christian Theology 101. What are some of the main doctrines of the faith? We looked at the advent of Jesus last time, and this is his first coming. So, beyond just that he came and the significance of what it means, that now there's a kingdom that has been established upon the earth, which of course, we saw that there's a kingdom with the establishment of Israel, that God created a kingdom from the very beginning, even. But I want to, but we looked at the Mashiach, and how when Mashiach comes, this is the grand climax of what all the prophets have written. But we see a duality in his comings, that it's not the first coming that's the ultimate climax. There's a climax at the end of the age with the second coming of Jesus. With Jesus coming, it's not just that he was born, but there was a life that he lived, and then at the end of the life there's a crucifixion. And this is what most people look at when they examine the gospel. They think the gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I disagree with that, but it's not a matter of disagreeing with. Well, I'll leave it at that. I do disagree with that. I think that the gospel is actually much larger than that. I think that it's the whole perspective of Jesus' second coming. The blessed hope is about there will be worldwide peace when Jesus comes again, and all nations will come unto Jerusalem. They'll beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation will not practice war anymore, and there will be redemption for all of Israel, and even nations themselves will have a redemption of sorts. And this is something that I think the gospel is speaking of. It's that ultimate end that all of our hearts long and desire for. That's the hope. So, what are we looking at here with the crucifixion? To understand, Jesus was God in the flesh. This is the incarnation, right? We all, as Christians, we all hold to the deity of Jesus. Otherwise, we're not orthodox in our faith. So, Jesus' crucifixion is the crucifixion of God. In Exodus 19 and 20, this is the Sinai pact. This is where the Ten Commandments are. At least in Exodus 20, that's the Ten Commandments. In Exodus 19, they come unto Sinai, and God speaks to Moses and tells Moses, tell the people to prepare themselves, for in 3 days I'm going to come upon the mount. They prepare themselves, God comes upon the mount, and it's a glorious spectacle that there's lightning and thunderings and the loud trumpet blast by the angels and smoke upon the mountain, and all of the Israelites tremble in fear when God starts speaking. So there's this, when Israel hears God, they desire instead to listen to Moses. So here's what I'm trying to get at. This sentence is kind of poorly worded here. Israel sees God come upon the mountain. They hear the trumpet blast. They hear God speaking directly to them, the Ten Commandments. And then they point to Moses and says, Moses, you go talk to God. We'll listen to what you say, but as for us, we don't want to hear God, lest we die. They haven't died. They heard God and they didn't die. But they instead put Moses as a mediator between them in fear. And so we have God as kind of the rejected God, even from this moment, that they had every opportunity to embrace God. And yet in that moment, because of fear, they put God far away but put Moses close. So that rejection is shown through all of the history. When you read the Old Testament from Exodus, when that story takes place, all the way through, there's over and over and over again, religious men, with several exceptions, continuously reject the judges, the prophets, the righteous priests. They reject the righteous kings. Once again, there are several exceptions. David is huge because he is the one king that everyone came to, and they loved and they adored David. And all of the tribes were united under David. He is like the one exception. But there are a couple a couple other exceptions where certain religious men were acceptant of Josiah, for example. But um, these stories where they seem to reject the judges, the prophets, the righteous priests, and etc., the righteous kings. This all culminates in the action of crucifying Jesus. This is what religious man does when it sees God, whether represented through the Sinai, or whether they're in questioning and rebelling against Moses, or whether it's in rejecting the prophets or the judges. Over and over again, we see the same pattern. God endures suffering. This is kind of what I see as the big significance of the crucifixion. This is what it tells us about God. God is willing to endure suffering on behalf of his creation, even from the foundation of the world. So what do I mean by this? Even from the foundation of the world. Am I going to go into this? No, not yet. Okay. So what I'm saying is, even from the foundation of the world, when you look at like Philippians chapter 2, that Jesus, being in the form God, or being like God, found it not robbery to be called equal with God, yet he stripped off his deity in a sense. Just like in John 13, he stripped off his outer garment and took on the towel like the servant would wear to wash his disciples' feet. So it says in Philippians 2 that we have Jesus taking off his outer garment of deity and becoming a servant of all, and learning obedience unto death, even the death on a cross. And this is Hebrews 8:5 that I'm pulling from with that. But Philippians 2, you can read it and you can see. And Paul is saying to the Philippian church, have the same mind as Jesus had when he did this. And we see, even from the foundation of the world, that God is a God who endures suffering on the behalf of his creation, because he is the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. The act in stripping off his deity was a cross in and of itself. The act of creating, knowing that there's the potential, and God foreknowing everything, knowing that Adam would take of the forbidden fruit. It was a suffering. It was a cross in a sense, to be able to bear it, to endure the suffering on behalf of the creation, knowing that there's going to be grieving, knowing that there's going to be suffering, even from the foundation of the world, even from the creation. And yet God endures this on behalf of his creation, so that he can bring blessing and benefit to his creation. So the call for us to take up our crosses and follow Christ is a call to be like Christ, suffering on behalf of others, dying to self, and even enduring much torment and mock and ridicule in the process. Just as Jesus blessed and did not curse, so too are we to bless. So even though we're going to endure much torment, mock, and ridicule in the process, which if you guys have looked at any of the comment sections on my YouTube videos, you probably recognize that I've received mock and ridicule. But I can give you stories from my past of how I have endured this. Ultimately, what it comes down to is there's a display in the bearing of your cross, in the denying of yourself, suffering on behalf of others, for their benefit. There's something that happens. There's a transaction in the heavenlies that the principalities and powers cannot comprehend that wisdom. They cannot, and therefore they want to snuff it out. And so they are zealous to bring about whatever they have to, whether religious men or atheists or whoever, to be able to start to mock, ridicule, persecute, torment. I've been threatened, but luckily I've never been beaten. But these are things that we should experience. And I'm not going to say that if you don't experience it that you're not following the call, but at some level you will experience this. To take it seriously, to take seriously the taking up of our cross and following Christ and being like Christ and suffering on behalf of others, and not just dying to self, because dying to self means we're dying to sin. Yeah, there's that, and we do need to die to sin, but once you've been raised and resurrected with Christ, you're free from sin. So how about, instead of continuing to say die to self, how about we start to realize we take up our cross not just for ourselves and for our own sin to die, but we take up our cross for the benefit of others. We take up our cross on behalf of others. There's a duality here. And I think we've missed that a lot in our Christian theology, is that we don't recognize there's a cross to take up, that you have to be willing. For example, a young lady that I knew needed to go to college. She wasn't able to afford tuition for the second semester of the year, and so we sent her enough money to be able to pay for that tuition. That's a denying. So we were saving up that money for a house, and we just went ahead and dropped everything from our bank account and sent it to her. Uh, you do that because that's what Jesus says to be, and that's what Jesus shows that he was. That's the kind of cross that you take up on behalf of others. It's whether it's material things or whether it's spiritual things, it doesn't matter. That's the kind of life that you live, deferring to one another, having all things in common with each other. So there's two aspects to the cross, specifically to the cross of Christ. There's two aspects. There's first the salvation and atonement, and this is the more common application of the cross. And the second is resurrection. So we see in Jesus dying on the cross that the how do I want to word this? In Leviticus 1 through 7, there are sacrifices that you have to give in order to be atoned before God. So the first chapter of Leviticus starts with essentially any man who wants to come near to God, if they want to be right before God, here's the sacrifice you have to give. You give the burnt offering, and that's the atonement for your sin. And then you give the peace offering. Why? Because now you have peace with God. And then you give the fellowship offering. Why? Because through the atonement and through having peace with God, now you have fellowship with God and with your fellow men who are also in that same atonement and peace with God. You can have fellowship and peace with them. And so this is why the fellowship offering, you don't just eat it yourself, but you invite others to eat it with you. And you go through the whole thing. But we see, in Leviticus 4, there's the sin offering. And why? Because the sin offering, we're prone to continue in our, there's cycles that we have to overcome our sin and our habits and our cycles and our temptations. And so there's the sin offering that you have to continue to give even after you've been atoned and even after you've made peace with God. And so you can go through Leviticus 1 through 7, and you can see all these sacrifices, and there's a logic to the way that you offer them and the order that you offer them in. And Jesus is the fulfillment of all these sacrifices, that we no longer have to offer bulls and goats, but we see Christ as the burnt offering. He's the one who was the lamb without spot. He's our Passover, so that he's our Passover. He's the scapegoat and the sacrifice on the Day of Atonement, so that he not only atones for all of Israel, but he also is the scapegoat that takes the sin away. So we see through the cross that there's two aspects to it. There's the salvation and atonement aspect, but then there's also the second aspect of resurrection. Let me get rid of this real quick. Okay. So it is not through Jesus' death that we have access to God, but through his resurrection. Now I know that Hebrews 10:19 through 22 says that we enter through the veil, which is his flesh. I know what it says, but in the New Testament, just over and over and over and over again, the emphasis is not upon Jesus' death alone, but upon his resurrection. It's through his resurrection. We've been baptized into his death, yes, but don't forget the rest of Romans 6:2 or 3, whatever verse that is. The same glory that raised Jesus has raised us, and therefore don't let ourselves be manipulated by sin and slaves to sin any longer, because we've been set free from it. And if we've been set free from it, then we're before God. And these are the sorts of statements that we have. Without the resurrection of Jesus, there's still no hope, still no salvation, and still no atonement, because it's not just about Jesus dying on the cross and that's our atonement. The resurrection is God vindicating that atonement. Okay? So all we have is a dead Messiah if we leave him on the cross or if we leave him in the grave. Obviously, that cannot be Messiah. So the resurrection is critical. It's not simply God's desire that Jesus would suffer crucifixion, but as I quoted earlier, Jesus tells us to take up our own crosses. So why can't death just be left at death. What I mean by this, why did Jesus have to die on the cross? Why a tortuous death? Why did he have to be tormented and have agony and anguish and torment and torture? I mean, the cross was a torture device. Why not just have him die? Have him get stabbed or something. I mean, still going to have torment and agony, but it's not going to be the same torture. And here's the deal. This is where we can see ourselves. It's because you and I are dead, so too must God die. The cross reflects our condition both of death and of sin. We see sin as torment and agony because through it we have death and separation from God. So what's our hope? Our hope is found in Christ's resurrection. It isn't that Jesus died for our sin, though that is true, but that he also was raised by God the Father. So too are we able to be raised from the death that we lived in. We have been made alive. Therefore, we are to act like we are alive, putting off the deeds of darkness and death, and to be that which we truly are now, because we've been made alive. So don't any longer dwell in the deeds of darkness and death, because you're now a child of light. You're now alive. You are now resurrected. You're no longer under the sinful nature. Now you've been made into a new creature who's no longer governed by the sinful nature. You see how these statements start to weave together. This is our hope. This is our freedom. It's that you've been set free for freedom's sake. So therefore, don't get rid of that freedom. As Paul would say, I think it's in Galatians even, some acts of freedom are your last act of freedom. That works both spiritually and physically. Yeah, I can go out and I can shoot somebody, but that's going to be my last act of freedom probably. I could rob a bank, but I'm going to be in prison then. That's my last act of freedom. I have the freedom to do that, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to remain free after that. And it's the same thing. Hebrews 12, I think it's verse 6. It talks about the reason why so many are remaining in sin is because we have not wrestled against sin to the shedding of blood, which should remind us of both Gethsemane and the crucifixion, that we have not wrestled it until we've shed blood, until we have truly died and been made alive. So these are my general thoughts in regards to crucifixion. I know there's a lot more I can go into, and there's a lot more that I can say regarding each one of these slides, but that's a general synopsis. Thanks for listening, and next we're going to be looking at the resurrection. I'm sure you can see it down here on my little slide there. Until next time, grace and peace to you in Christ, and I wish you freedom in God the Father through Christ, in fellowship through the Holy Spirit. Have a blessed day. I'll see you next time.